Happy second week of August, I think it is. Welcome. We're glad to have you here. We've got a healthy number in the room so far. So we'll get started because there is a lot to talk about here. And we are thrilled that you all are attending, and we are honored to have our panelists with us. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network. I'm really pleased to be dialing in today from Camp Allen down outside of Houston in Texas. As I was telling our panelists, it is a little bit toasty here, but All Saints Chapel is in the background and beautiful Camp Allen is laying out before me. And I'm grateful to Stanford and Leah and the Diocese of Texas for hosting me for the next couple of days. We are really thrilled to be having this conversation about innovative ministry models. And I want to remind you that we have these conversations regularly on topics just like this, and we have several more upcoming webinars in this month. So please check out our website to see those, get signed up on our email list. And don't forget that next March 3rd through 6th, we will be in Charlotte, North Carolina for the largest annual gathering in the Episcopal Church. Stanford is on our planning committee and is busy helping us as we imagine what that is going to look like. It's going to be another exciting time, and we are thrilled to welcome you all to Charlotte next year. And without any further ado, I'm going to thank our panelists once again. Thank you all for being with us. And I'm going to hand it off to Stanford down at Good Shepherd in Austin. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe. We're glad to be with you all today. I'm Stanford Adams. I'm the acting rector at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd in Austin, Texas. And I'm really glad to be joined by my fellow panelists today, the Very Reverend Melinda Hall, the Dean of the Cathedral of St. Paul in Erie, Pennsylvania, Carly Rowe, the Executive Director of Erie Episcopal Collaborative, also in Erie, and my colleague here at Good Shepherd, the Reverend Leah Wise, who's the priest for The Hill, our second campus here in Austin. We want to do this webinar in 3 parts here. We're going to take some time to describe our 2 models of ministry for you so that you have some background of what we're talking about. Then we've got some questions for each other and a conversation for each other about similarities and differences in our particular models. And then we want to take your questions at the end of our hour together. So I'd encourage you to write your questions down, and as we come toward the end of our time, to put those in the chat so that we can answer your questions. You know, the models we're going to talk about are the result of risk-taking on our part and some creative thinking in our parish systems, and a desire to expand ministry beyond just the way we've known it in the past. And we hope that you come away from this conversation with some new ideas about models and structures that you might use in your ministry. You may be considering models that involve some of the same features of our particular ministry structures, or it may look very different in your context than in the 2 that we're going to talk about. But either way, you know, we would say that our structure and organization of our ministries is going to need to look in some ways different in the future than it has in the past. And we hope you come away from this conversation with some new ideas and creative thinking in your particular context. So I'm going to toss it up to our friends in Erie to tell us about your model.
Thank you, Stanford. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're glad to be with you. We figured that in order to fully appreciate and understand the Erie Episcopal model, it's important to first understand the 2 congregations that now make up the Erie Episcopal model. So St. Mark's Episcopal Church is a congregation that is just on the outskirts of the city of Erie, just into the suburbs, Mill Creek Township. Actually, the city line runs right through our property that divides the township and the city. And it was a congregation in the 70s and 80s that, of course, like many Episcopal churches, had their boom. It was the sort of heyday of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in the 70s and 80s. And then, of course, like so many other places, began to see a period of significant decline. And so we find ourselves about a decade ago with a congregation that was less than 40 people on a Sunday morning, no real congregational strategy for growth and development, and a building that was in pretty significant disrepair. At that time, the diocese decided that St. Mark's would be the first of its kind sort of parallel redevelopment in the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania, meaning that the diocese would intervene at St. Mark's, providing them with financial resources and also some staff stability to reinvent themselves and see what they could do. Now, the interesting part of the St. Mark's model at the time was the understanding was that the less than 40 people would stay in place and be part of that redevelopment as well as using the building as it existed as part of that redevelopment as well. So we started that work just over a decade ago, again, starting somewhere around 40 people. Fast forward to the pandemic, just prior to the pandemic, becoming a congregation of just shy of 200 people on a Sunday morning. The other important piece of that model is that in the early stages of the redevelopment, we toyed with many different staffing models of St. Mark's, and it went from anywhere from a full-time priest and a part-time associate to a part-time associate and a full-time lay person to full-time lay people and a quarter-time pig. And so after experimenting with all of those models of staffing, ultimately what was decided in the St. Mark's model was that there would be 2 full-time lay people and a very quarter-time vicar, a very quarter-time priest. So at the time it was myself and my colleague Craig Dressler, who has since moved on to the diocesan staff. But part of the uniqueness of the early stages of the model, and then what carried us into just prior to the pandemic, was that all of the water, so to speak, of parish life, congregational redevelopment, the administration of the parish, the administration of the liturgy, the sort of complexities of running a parish were in the hands of 2 full-time lay people with a quarter-time priest. The cathedral is, of course, exactly what we say it is. It is the Cathedral of St. Paul in downtown Erie, Pennsylvania. It has been the cathedral church of the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania since 1911. Prior to the pandemic, the cathedral is, again, exactly what you would think when you think of the building and the structure and the liturgy and the music, and having a dean who had been in place at this cathedral for 32 years. Taking us again right to prior to the pandemic, the dean announced his retirement, so both places find themselves at an interesting pivot point. The pandemic happens, full stop on everything in terms of parish life and congregational life as we know it.
Right. And so then as far as like transitioning during the pandemic, trying to figure out how we're all going to do worship, I'm sure you remember that or want to suppress it. But anyway, St. Mark's and the cathedral found themselves quite responsible together for helping negotiate and figure out what diocesan worship was going to look like. And so we found ourselves as 2 joint staffs constantly on Zoom with one another and beginning to really work with one another in new and different ways. And through the course of that, developed a certain amount of collegiality, obviously, but also began to really realize the sort of challenges that one congregation would have would be balanced by the gifts of the other, and vice versa. That the challenges and the gifts between the 2 places were really inversely related in ways that were really interesting to discover. And so we began to think sort of about that, and the conversation began to develop around like, well, okay, well, how could we sort of do some joint hires that might actually help eliminate some of those challenges and sort of live further into our gifts? And so that's what we began to do in the pandemic. And then coming out of the pandemic, began to sort of have and lengthen those conversations.
So post-pandemic, it was clear to us that we were at a decision point. The 2 congregations could have decided to go back to what we were doing and maintain both of those independent models as independent congregations, because the important point to remember about the 2 congregations at that point is that they were both financially stable and also numbers-wise on a Sunday morning stable in terms of being able to keep going, and just as it was prior to the pandemic. We also could have made a decision at that time to just merely co-pay staff. We could have just said, the staff model is thus, and we're going to have an administrator that we share, or we're going to have a youth person that we share. They both work independently in the systems. That would have been one way or 2 ways of doing business. But at that particular moment in time, the decision was, it was a decision to continue further down the road of collaboration and choose a different path to become deeper involved in the collaboration, what is now known as Erie Episcopal.
Yeah, so just some pictures here of sort of what Erie Episcopal and folks relating to that. So the process that we used then didn't unfold in a necessarily like linear format. We began really meeting with both congregations have different leadership bodies, and so we were meeting together with those discernment sort of teams, working on how this might lay out. We engaged in the joint hires. We began a lot of listening sessions within the congregations in different varieties at different times for as many people as possible to participate. We began just sort of throwing the spaghetti against the wall and doing trial runs of different events. And so, putting our outreach teams particularly together, reconstructing those. And so we began then to think of ourselves sort of as one staff. with two congregations that maintain sort of their own independent governing bodies, their own independent finances, but who share they share a vision and mission for the city of Erie, in addition to sharing a staff. I've redrawn this org chart more times than I would like to describe, but this is where it stands now and sort of how it operates. And folks really do understand sort of layers of belonging, in that, those are the logos to the side of St. Mark's and the cathedral. And so they maintain separate identities, but most things overlap in Erie Episcopal. If you come on a Sunday morning in either place, you'll experience kind of their unique iteration of it, but then everything else programmatically runs together. So that's sort of what we've been experimenting with, which has some similarities with our colleagues down in Texas, but I think we'd love to hear from them. And so I'm going to pass the mic to Stanford and Leah.
Great, thank you. Thanks for describing the model up in Erie. About 20 years ago here at Good Shepherd, it was clear that our parish facilities were no longer adequate. They were both aging and they were too small to accommodate our parish and its growth, along with the growth of the city of Austin all around us. And the parish planned a building campaign and a capital campaign, and had a desire as part of this to diversify the people that we were coming into contact with. The neighborhood around our campus where I am now, our older campus, was becoming increasingly affluent, and it was limiting the number and diversity of people that we were coming into contact with. So we had a desire in all of this to reach new neighbors, and the parish committed to spending 10%, a tithe of our capital dollars, on a new physical location that would expand the neighbors that we came into contact with. We knew we needed a temporary location for our preschool that's here on our main campus during construction while we tore its building down and rebuilt it. And we started talking to the Diocese of Texas about the site of a former Episcopal parish that's across town that had closed about 10 years prior, so about 20 years ago now. And our imagination grew as we considered this site and looked at it. And it looked to us like it could be a good temporary location for our school. And then as we looked at it, we imagined a new permanent worshiping community there and a new second preschool for our parish. So we imagined that this would be the place we would spend our tithe on our capital campaign to create a new location and meet new neighbors. So we ended up investing 10% of our capital dollars in this location. We took possession of it from the diocese. And in 2014 and 2015, it was the site of our preschool on this campus while we tore its building down and rebuilt it. Then in 2016, we started a worshiping community at our second site at the Hill. And in May of 2018, we opened a second school on that location. And Leah, you want to show us some photos here? Leah's going to put up some photos of our main campus here on the Windsor campus. Here's a photo. Yeah, scroll us back to the beginning. All right, there we go. So here's our Windsor campus that's been here about 80 years now. And this was our original location, kind of from which we were doing this streaming. And you can get a sense of its size there.
I'm sorry, things are being buggy. Keep going.
It occupies much of a block that's a little bit west of downtown Austin and west of the University of Texas campus here in Austin. And so we went across town. This is a map of the central part of Austin. So we went from the west side of downtown and UT's campus to the southeast part of town. And that's what we're talking about here at the Hill there in the bottom right of the map. And here's a photo of the Hill campus after our work on the buildings there. And you can see it takes its name from the wonderful view it has of downtown Austin from its perch atop a hill. So there you can see we're out on the hill looking at the downtown skyline. And this is very much for us a dual campus model. We are one parish with two physical locations. So we have one vestry, we file one parochial report, we have one set of wardens, one budget, but we carry out our ministry in these two different locations. Our priest for the hill, which is Leah, primarily serves as the leader of the worshiping community at the hill. We have some staff members who are also primarily at the hill. Um, and then about once a month or so, clergy from our main campus rotate at the hill and have some presence there. There are some ways we operate that are completely unified from a financial and administrative perspective, from a facilities and maintenance perspective, from a communication perspective. We're really entirely unified. And there's some ways that the Hill operates partly or mostly independently. I would say liturgically, the Hill has a lot of independence, and with respect to programmatic choices, the Hill has a lot of independence. There's a significant size difference between the worshiping communities. The Hill represents about 10% of the parish's ASA. Smaller means that the Hill is really nimble, can make decisions and carry out change quite easily. And that's really changed the culture of the whole parish system. And it's also sometimes a friction point with a much larger campus here, where we can't be quite as nimble often in our decision making and change. I want to take just a minute also to mention the preschool that we started over at the Hill in 2018, because this was part of our parish's kind of vision for meeting new neighbors and encountering new folks in the neighborhood around the Hill. We opened Hillside Early Childhood Center as a year-round, all-day program, starting with kids who are 6 weeks old up to 5 years old. It's designed to prepare kids for kindergarten in a part of the city that's really a childcare desert, where there are few options for high quality early childhood education. And the parish provides significant scholarship support for students so that we can expand access through the school. And this requires a lot of parishioners who support Hillside directly, and some money from the parish too. So that very much features into what this model is all about for us. In the spring of 2024, we were really fortunate to call the Reverend Leah Wise to be priest for the Hill. So Leah's been with us for about a year and a half now. And we told her when we called her, and I think this remains to be true, that she is in part a church planter in what is kind of like a church plant. And she is partly the rector of a small parish. And she's also partly an associate in a big corporate-sized parish system. And I think all of those things are true. So that's the quick and dirty overview of our model. And I want to ask you all a question up in Erie. It sounds like your experiment and the risk taking associated with your model came out of your particular context. What were the features that you thought were most important, provided the most important impetus for y'all to give this a try?
Thanks, Stanford, and thanks for sharing about Texas. I think one of it is that the distance between us is not far. It's maybe 4 miles. And so this sort of decision that competition is a little bit silly in the face of the gospel, really. It's certainly not what we're called to do. And so this decision that maybe if we work together, we could actually benefit from the economies of scale that would provide. So, two places that work together can offer more programs. Both of our budgets contain money for outreach, so we can actually double our impact in the city and not bifurcate our energies either. We can really focus on various things and make a bigger difference by investing more people there and investing more funds there. And I think too, one of us is a suburban place, suburban as Erie goes, and one is downtown. And so the ability to reach people in 2 really different places, and also the experiences of St. Mark's and the experience of the cathedral on a Sunday morning are really, really different. And so, we could be sad about that, or we could realize that's a little bit the special sauce of why this works, and that, people seem to sort of resonate with one of those or the other. And so it gives us a great sort of cross across the city and across demographics and across sort of how people choose to worship and affiliate. So I think those were some of the contextual things on our minds. But I know your Windsor campus sets in a particular kind of neighborhood that shifted and changed. And so I'm wondering how that works for you guys.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the original impetus for us was a desire to expand our ministry. a desire to have a broader vision than just what was possible with the folks we were coming into contact with at our Windsor campus. And tell us, Leah, a little more about kind of the context right around the Hill.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a relative newcomer to Austin, what is interesting about this city, and maybe this is just cities, and I don't have a lot of experience, but it is very much a neighborhood city, and people go to their neighborhood church, at least in the Episcopal Church. And so, if you're going to try to reach a different group of people, you actually would have to physically, geographically relocate in many cases. So the neighborhood that the Hill is located in is demographically very interesting. The church sits in between two neighborhood associations. One of them is a historic, sort of affluent neighborhood. And then the other one is one of the poorest, highest crime neighborhoods in the city. And it's like less than a mile to either place. And so that creates a lot of opportunity. This part of the city is also where a lot of transplants who are part of the tech industry have relocated. And so we've got a little bit less of a kind of generational grounding here, a lot more of a mobile kind of population, which is one of the challenges of the Hill. Is we might have a person who's become foundational to the church and then they move a year later. And this has just been like the history of the Hill since its inception. But it provides a lot of opportunity for, I think, like a beloved community that is not hard to build because it is actually reflecting what this neighborhood looks like.
So one of the key differences, I'd say, in our two models is the governing structure. Tell us more in Erie, from a Episcopal governance perspective, y'all are two separate parishes. Is that right?
That's correct. So if you go back to Melinda's original diagram of the circles, right? So we understand that St. Mark's is St. Mark's. St. Mark's has a vestry and its own budget and its own finances. And we've kept everything separate in terms of the way we run and gather stewardship. The cathedral runs its own budget. The cathedral has its own separate bishops committee, vestry, and runs their own budget. The unique overlap, though, in the governance is that now the outreach teams are populated by people from both congregations, and the pastoral care team is people from both congregations. But in terms of the actual governance of the parish, we have kept the vestries and the money separate. That is different from what you do in Texas, right?
Yeah, our model is that we're one parish. So for all of those, in all of those respects that you're mentioning, we're at the opposite end of the spectrum. We have one vestry, one set of wardens, one budget. How does that work practically for y'all to have two governing bodies, both responsible for this collaboration? Are there moments where that works better and moments where that's a challenge?
I don't know, Melinda, you want to take that?
Sure, I can take that. I think both institutions maintain sort of separate but very similar core value structures, and both of them have sort of different each year a sort of set of strategic impetuses that they're working on, and so they're sort of working in parallel on those things. But I noticed that the quality of the conversations at like vestry meetings, we're not only considering like the cathedral, but we're also considering Erie Episcopal. How are we going to do this together? And I think we've made some deliberate choices to gather them a couple times a year in order to have joint conversations. And so actually, I think that Erie Episcopal has broadened everyone's horizon in really, really positive ways. We do our due diligence in all manner, and so does the vestry at St. Mark's, as far as doing the things that canon stipulate. But doing so with sort of a broader horizon and understanding ourselves in partnership in new ways has been really helpful, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I think about a lot with my particular position in the Good Shepherd system is I actually have to cross the bridge on Congress Avenue to get to the other campus. And that bridge has become very symbolic to me because I'm going back and forth. And I feel often like as a clergy in this system, I am functionally the bridge between the two campuses in the most sort of meaningful, dynamic, regular way. And I'm wondering where your bridges are in your system. Where are the intersections? Who's sort of the ambassador carrying the banner back and forth between the two systems?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think now during the week, in particular with the outreach ministries and the formation ministries and the things that we do, sort of spirituality driven liturgies midweek, there's a lot of overlap, and there's also a lot of overlap with the staff. So people from both congregations are interacting with the staff. We really do understand that the staff model is structured in such a way that the admin serves both congregations. We're all technically housed in the cathedral, but the admin is seen in both systems as the admin. The youth person is seen in both systems as the youth person. And so I think it's through the interaction with the staff, but it's now so through the interaction with all of the joint programming. We've said before, if you show up at one of these churches on a Sunday morning, you may or may not know that this Erie Episcopal thing is even a thing, that it's even happening. But midweek programming, all of the formation, the adult formation, the spirituality, the midweek services are cross-populated now by people from both congregations. So I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, Stanford and Leah, how perhaps like the sort of the hill and the process of getting to that point, how both places mutually experience a kind of revived vitality based on your collaboration and partnership and work.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that people across our system are really excited about the Hill. Even folks who attend the Windsor campus never go to the Hill. They're glad to be in a parish system that has a broad view of what ministry is and a broad view of what we want to be about in the city. And so it's injected kind of pride into the system, I think, for a lot of folks. I would say it's also increased our capacity to take risks and try new things, because we have what sometimes we call a research and development department over at the Hill that can be very nimble and adapt very quickly to try things. And it's fine if it doesn't work. We'll just try something new. And that has over time, we're 9 years in now, and that's changed the culture of the whole parish in what I would view as a really positive way. We really don't hear, but that's the way we've always done it. And that's just not part of the culture. And I think that comes in large part because of the Hill. What would you add to that, Leah?
Yeah, I think from the hillside, being connected with a larger sort of legacy campus in a way, a congregation that has been rooted here for a long time is a really helpful foundation for a church plant. And in a place where people are moving a lot, and in a congregation that tends to be very few cradle Episcopalians, much more likely to be basically unchurched, to have that rootedness and connection to people who have been Christians in the Episcopal way for a long time and who have that sense of understanding of liturgy and community, and that they're still like the people who came over to sort of seed the Church of the Hill 9 years ago. Many of them are still at the Hill, and if they're not, they've maybe gone back to Windsor, but they still have this. They still love the Hill and they're still very supportive of it. And so in a way, the vitality is going in the opposite direction. The Hill doesn't have to learn how to be flexible. That is our bread and butter. That's what we are every day. But to have that sense of like, we are not just like out on a limb here with no support, I think that makes the risk that we take feel less scary.
So what would y'all say are your primary challenges up in Erie? What's been challenging about this model?
Right. So I think one of the things is we're always threading this needle of identity and belonging. Like, what do you identify with? Do you identify with St. Mark's? Do you identify with the cathedral? Do you identify as Erie Episcopal? Part of the interesting thing on the model is that the people who have come in post Erie Episcopal, so in other words, post pandemic, after we have already been living into this model, and they come in and if you ask the newest people in the system where they go to church, while they may identify as a cathedral person, they say they're part of Erie Episcopal. Whereas the people sort of pre-Erie Episcopal would say, well, I go to St. Mark's, but St. Mark's is in this creative collaboration with Erie Episcopal. So we're always threading that needle of where do you belong and what is your identity, and walking a very fine line between do you identify with an individual congregation? Do you identify with the Erie Episcopal model? What is it about? How do you understand yourselves as, how do we understand ourselves as Erie Episcopal? How does this actually work? So I do think that continues to be an ongoing sort of challenge for us. And also thinking back to Leah's question about the governance and how you relate to one another, there is some challenges in that when you're running two separate vestries instead of one. Obviously, as Melinda said, while there are agreed upon sort of core values and understandings of who we are and where we're going, the challenge of sort of integrating that is still very much present. I assume you're going to tell me that there are still challenges in the model and at Good Shepherd and the Hill.
Well, I was just going to mention that I think the advantage of having one vestry is also it's a disadvantage. It means that all these decisions can be made with kind of one governing body, but you have to be really conscientious about who's in the room when those decisions are made, because you still have to have representation from the Hill, which we do a really good job of. I can probably mostly credit Stanford for this. We have more representation on the vestry that primarily attend the Hill than 10%. And I think that's part of what is the challenge, is that in order to be equitable with such a drastic difference in kind of influence across the parish system, you actually have to have a little bit more representation from the smaller community. At least that's been my experience here. And we have basically a paravestry at the Hill who I have started calling my leadership, which they like for some reason. They don't find it condescending. But the leadership team at the Hill, we make a lot of the sort of on the ground decisions that don't require the sort of formal governance of the vestry. That just helps us with a lot of our programming, because it wouldn't make sense for it to be top down coming from the vestry.
Yeah, I think Leah's just right. This model for us requires a kind of constant eye on who's in the room when decisions are made, and are we representing the views and interest of the folks who attend the Hill and their perspectives. Because our ASA is so heavily weighted to the Windsor campus, it's possible for that to not just happen organically. We have to make sure it's happening. We've also, I think, really had an eye on cultivating parish-wide leadership from the people at the Hill. Because our goal is to broaden the perspective of the whole system, we really benefit from having leaders who have come to the Good Shepherd system, not through the Windsor campus, but they've decided to join us from the Hill. And we have some amazing parish-wide leaders who've come to us through the Hill. Our current senior warden primarily attends the Hill. We've had past wardens who also primarily attend the Hill. Last time we had a search committee, it was co-chaired by someone who attends the Hill. So we've done, I think, a good job of keeping an eye on, making sure we're cultivating parish-wide leaders from the congregation there.
I had one question that came up when you all were presenting. I noticed the priority on having lay people in sort of executive positions, and that pre-existed the Erie Collaborative. And I'm wondering if that, I imagine that has been intentional, but I'm interested in learning a little bit more about how that decision, rather than having a clergy person in some of those higher level jobs, how that decision has impacted the collaborative, and maybe how it has sort of theologically and communally, relationally informed your congregations.
Melinda's not jumping at the chance to answer that.
No. I didn't know if you wanted to start with St. Mark's or not, because
Yeah.
but I come with my own convictions. I'm an ordained person, but my ministry is that it called to that in a particular way. But I actually Erie Episcopal wouldn't exist without Carly Rowe and her good thoughtfulness and the sort of amazing gifts she brings to the table. And the vast majority of our staff is lay people. It's just myself and the associate who is primarily at St. Mark's that are ordained. And so I think coming with the conviction that people are called in a variety of ways to bring a tremendous number of gifts to the table. Expecting a priest to have all the gifts, I just think is sheer nonsense. And so, and everyone now can light me up in the chat, but, Carly makes sure that things just function so well, and our person who does youth facilitates that beautifully. And I think it also sends a message throughout the entire system that people who attend these congregations are called by God to various forms of ministry. Our outreach teams, they control their budgets, they make decisions, they have a staff liaison person who may or may not be lay or may not be ordained, but they're called to those ministries. And so we embody that from people in pews to every level of the system, really. And if you remember my beautiful chart, which some people like and don't like, the center dots are like almost exactly the same color, because Carly and I pretty much carry the same weight in the system, really, or we try to, and flatten that hierarchy as much as possible. I mean, Carly, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question. I mean, especially, Leah, since we're all coming out of this Episcopal tradition that we love very much, or we wouldn't be doing what we do. But St. Mark's is sort of used to functioning with a different mode of operation, because it's been more than a decade since they've actually had a full-time rector at St. Mark's. And so the original iteration of the redevelopment were two sort of front and center lay people who were picking up all of the balls that would ordinarily be picked up by an ordained person in the system, except, of course, the sacramental piece.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting, challenging piece at St. Mark's has been that if the lay person in the system, so myself and at the time my other full-time lay colleague, were actually the leaders of the system, is it possible to be the leaders of the system but not be the fundamental presence on Sunday morning preaching and celebrating the Eucharist, which is part of what we do as Episcopalians? And that has been a unique sort of experiment. I think in our instance, St. Mark's has proven that it is possible for that shared leadership model to actually work at a very high level.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a great question, and a very valid question, especially given the traditions that we are functioning in.
And I would just say that's part of what, like, if we think about replication of models, one of the things to consider is not just how a church calls a priest, which I understand to be very important. I'm not naive about our ecclesiology, but I do think there are ways in which we can creatively think about how people are called and what position they hold in church, whether they are ordained or not. And so I think this model allows and opens the door for some of that experimentation within the bounds of the canons, obviously.
Yeah, thank you all for starting to put questions in the chat here. Please keep the questions coming. We would love to engage you who've been listening to our conversation and hear what questions you have and answer them. I'm seeing one talking about search processes. For us here at Good Shepherd, we've had 2 search processes that have occurred since we implemented this model. And to answer your question of how we involve folks from both campuses, I think the key is intentionality. This goes back to an earlier answer about parish leadership and our need to constantly be intentional about cultivating leadership from the Hill. We have to do the same when we're, for example, writing a parish profile. We've got to cultivate participation in that process by people at the Hill. So if we have focus groups that are meeting, I'm thinking back to the last time we wrote a parish profile, sometimes those are happening at the Hill. And we, generally speaking, to get good representation, we need to overweight the opportunities for people to participate at the Hill. And so we just constantly have an eye on that. And that really goes beyond just a search process. That's kind of an every parish-wide decision that we're making that has implications for the Hill. Does that sound right to you, Leah?
Yeah, I would say maybe a more recent example of this is that we've been in a strategic planning process since last fall. And that process included groups from, in a way, we're not just 2 campuses, we're multiple mini congregations who go to different services on Sundays and attend different programs. So we made sure that we had representation in mixed focus groups, and also that we had specific conversations happening at the Hill. And then the Hill is also doing its own strategic planning that is campus specific. And so there's always a sort of multi-step process to making sure that we're paying attention to all voices.
There's a question in the chat further up about either of our communities having smaller home church for fellowship and study. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the person means, so sorry, but I mean, we have some small groups that do meet, and that does happen here. I don't know about for you guys.
We have a lot of kind of affinity groups, like Mom's Bible Study and Men's Bible Study and Dad's Bible Study and older women's Bible study. We have a lot of these types of affinity groups. Most of them actually do meet at the churches. We don't have a really robust small group model, though that has been asked for by some members of the congregation. So at least at the Hill, I think we are in a very proto discernment phase for building out something like that.
So I'm just noticing several questions, Carly, in the chat about St. Mark's. So just to clarify, this system that we're in actually has ordained person me at the cathedral and ordained person associate priest at St. Mark's. So to the one question, there is Eucharist offered every Sunday because there is a priest there every Sunday. So sorry for the lack of clarity, my friend Liz Wilcox on that. So, and then there's Carly, how about this? I'll ask you a question. How did the leadership of St. Mark's and the cathedral sell the idea of Erie Episcopal? Do you want to field that since my voice has already been heard?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks to Jeremy for asking that question. Part of, I think, the obstacle in the sell of the Erie Episcopal model was that it was hard for our folks in both the cathedral system and the St. Mark's system to conceptualize of a way in which we were going to do this that wasn't ultimately going to lead to a merger. The understanding of the way we were setting this up was that the sort of uncreative route to go was that ultimately the two congregations would merge and there would be one budget and one vestry and we would be running one big operation. But part of the beauty of why the model works is because the worshiping identities on Sunday morning are so unique and so different. So the cathedral is very traditional, St. Mark's is more blended, and the ethos of the two congregations are very different. And so it was a lot of intentional conversation around, if we were to merge and we were to just go into one big operation that was the Erie Episcopal, whatever we were going to call it, actually something would be lost. We would actually be losing big pieces of the identities of both places. And so the beauty of the model is that they are unique enough to sort of hold their own and hold this Erie Episcopal identity. Now, I'm the people that work with me know I'm pretty straight shooter. I'm not going to even attempt to tell you, Jeremy, that it was easy. It was a difficult sell, and there was a lot of suspicion, I think, in the early sort of meetings of the two vestries and the sort of onboarding of key lay people and stakeholders in the congregation to say, no, we're not merging. We're really not merging. And it took a long time, and it took a lot of relationship building. So generating the buy-in, I would say, was primarily done through relationship building with key stakeholders, number one, and getting those key stakeholders to participate in the ministries that actually solidified the Erie Episcopal piece of the identity. So I hope that helps.
A lot of it was people beginning, just ensuring people had opportunities to relate to one another. Joining the sort of outreach ministries that we engage in to the community built really good relationships between folks, and also just being fully transparent about the project in every single way and allowing a lot of it to just percolate up. It did not come from the top down. I think that's an important piece of, like, it developed over a series of conversations, both on a staff level and a governance structure level, like among the governing bodies, but also just with people in pews having conversations. So, yeah.
Do you all find that you have to keep selling it? I mean, is this something you have to keep in front of your people?
Yes, I mean, that's a great question. And we had talked about that a little bit in the pre-webinar conversations. And I think that one of the things for Erie Episcopal to actually learn from the Austin model is that I think Austin does a much better job of continually telling the story and telling, who we are and sort of re-explaining the identity and why this is the way it is. And I think the answer to the question is yes. But probably one of the things that we need to pay more attention to is that the actual retelling of the story. And that's actually something we picked up from you in the last couple of weeks of these conversations.
Well, and I think one of the, we were talking about challenges earlier, but one of the challenges I think is always, well, this is probably true for any institution, the temptation to settle, right? I mean, you have your institutional bell curve, you got to kind of like iterate off the side or you die eventually. So, you know, I mean, Erie Episcopal's reached a kind of like plateau where it is generally accepted. And I, at least in my system, more in the cathedral, don't, it's kind of like, oh yeah, Erie Episcopal, this is the thing we do now, which is actually remarkable that it's gotten to that point in the few number of years that it has been. But I think the temptation is to just sort of settle. And I think what we're in this new season of our lives, we're like, okay, now this is what Erie Episcopal is. How do we integrate these parishes more deeply? What is the next step in this story that takes us further along this journey of sort of this collaboration? What are we missing? What should we be seeing differently? But I'm wondering how that works for you guys. And we mentioned that you do a really great job of telling your story. So perhaps you'd love to share more about that.
We've learned a lot from y'all too. Let me say that. We do find ourselves just having to tell the story over and over again. And we've done that over the years in a few different ways. We convened a task force about 5 years into this model to reassess the model and decide whether we wanted to stick with this model. And the task force came back and said, yes, this is working, and we re-up for this dual campus model. And that was helpful at giving us a way to narrate again what we're about and to reaffirm our commitment to it. But we have to, at least on this campus, tell the story of why we're over at the Hill, why it matters to us, and how we see ourselves as broader than just being here. One of the ways we've done that recently is through a school supply drive that we've been conducting over the last month or so. We have a ministry that's led by parishioners at the Hill Community Ministry, and they provide a lot of support for 3 Austin School District elementary schools in the neighborhood of the Hill. And so we've been collecting school supplies for them on both of our campuses. And it gives us every Sunday a way to talk about the Hill and what's happening from the Hill. And, you know, so we just look for every opportunity we get to keep it in front of folks.
Yeah, I will also say that even our bulletins we use the same format for our bulletins across all of our services on both campuses. And so we share an announcements page. And if we're going to share an announcements page, it actually becomes imperative, particularly at the Hill, that I remind people there's another campus. We do occasionally have poor people trying to go to a funeral at the other campus and end up on the wrong one. So anyway, that's the worst case scenario. But this sense of it actually has to be verbalized a lot, because we are trying to invite people to a lot of the events of the church across campuses. And just as a matter of hospitality, that means we have to remind people that there are 2 places. And from the Hill perspective, I think one of the richest gifts is that even though they're in a very non-traditional small church setting, they can go to these more traditional Anglican services. They can go to evensongs. They can go to choral recitals and these sorts of things at the other campus. So they're getting the benefit of big church and small church model simultaneously.
That sort of answer. There's a question in the chat from Jenny about activities that have been particularly useful or not useful for open and fruitful conversations. I think Leah sort of just alluded to that in that answer. And anything you guys would add to that, Stanford and Leah?
I'd say this is a question that is often on our minds. I mean, we have not, at least up to now, 9 years in, settled on exactly the right place, you know, on the question of what programming should we have that is unified and what should be distinct on our 2 campuses. So we have tried some things in a combined way that have not worked very well. And we have tried some things separate and thought, ooh, this was a miss. We should have done this together. And so we just keep this question open for us all the time, I would say.
Yeah. I was just going to say, one of the major problems in Austin is just horrible traffic. And so weekday programming that takes place at a physical location is not going to capture someone across town. And so that has been a continuing challenge for us in particular. But yeah, how has it been for you all?
I was just going to say along the lines of what you're saying, which is perhaps slightly different than the question in the chat there, is, back to sort of what Stanford was saying, we started out trying to ensure and make sure that people understood this was not a merger, right? So we will have stuff equally in each building. We will use each building equally. And so I think we've been able to migrate away from that and say, so what are the particular charisms of each congregation? Like what makes sense to have in the space, because that's actually in like the wheelhouse of that place. And so, St. Mark's traditionally was like a very Bible study kind of place. And so let's have all of our formation stuff happen there, because that makes sense. It's in their DNA, right? In a really good way. Okay, well, like sort of the artsy, cathedraly spirituality services, those are kind of more in the wheelhouse. So let's keep that down there. And so then it's not like, oh, let's make sure we've divided the ledger between the buildings, but let's actually like live into the gifts of each place in a way that is really feels very authentic and life-giving, but it requires a lot of attention. And I think the risk of sort of like not paying enough attention and not ensuring some sort of balance of programmatic things is always sort of a risk there. I don't know what you would add to that, Carly, if anything.
No, but I just think it goes back to the whole idea that the whole concept of area Episcopal was organic, and part of the answer to Jenny's question is that not necessarily the conversations, but the projects that we were participating in, because the cathedral was naturally inclined because of its location toward a very robust homeless ministry. St. Mark's, because of its location, was naturally inclined toward a school partnership ministry. And so how do you just engage both conversations in both of those ministries on a much larger scale was actually sort of how that happened much more organically than one might have thought. So I hope, Jenny, we talked a lot around that question, but I hope we answered it.
Well, and I've got a follow-up for y'all along these same lines. How does the fact that y'all office mostly in one location, how does that affect this? How does that play into the location of programming, just as an example?
We're not competing, I think, as Melinda said before, we're not competing with the same sort of obstacles that you are in Austin. I mean, if I left the cathedral office right now, I could be to St. Mark's in less than 10 minutes and not have, even if there was a traffic snag, it would be maybe 12 minutes. That would be on a really, really bad day. I think culturally, for the sake of the identity of Erie Episcopal and for the identity of the staff, being in one location has been instrumental and actually become, I think, a non-negotiable in terms of the culture of Erie Episcopal and the staff. St. Mark's, the fortunate piece for St. Mark's was that they were not used to having a weekday office presence, even prior to the pandemic, because the administrator at St. Mark's was always part-time. And so when we came back and lived more fully into the area Episcopal model, it really was simply that now the good news is for St. Mark's, somebody is actually going to answer the phone all day, every day, because there's a full-time administrator. We actually just stopped publishing the St. Mark's phone number. And so now everybody understands that the church phone number is the cathedral's. And that they will find the staff here. So it's the drop-off location, it's the pickup location. It actually that was an easier transition than one might have thought, but I think it was primarily grounded in the fact that St. Mark's was not necessarily wedded to a model where somebody was in that office every day. So that made our job easier. Mm-hmm. For you, I mean, how do you navigate the back and forth? You don't. You try not to.
We have really limited office space at the Hill, and we actually have expanded some of our office space. I try to office at the Hill a majority of the week. Part of that is because we have the school there, and it's important for me to have that in-person partnership with them. And partly, I think, because we are still trying to make sure people know we exist and are open again. I mean, there are people who've been around this area long enough that they remember the previous church that closed down. So I think there's still some of that work to do in like establishing that we're open. I would say open for business, open for worship, and that there's a priest who could probably talk to you. So that's a little bit. I mean, I think on the other hand, I am always at the Windsor campus on Wednesdays, and I come in and out for various meetings. And I think the same benefit that you all have described is true here as well, that we do actually need to be in physical space together to actually dream about what it means for us to be one parish. So that does make a difference.
There's a great question in the chat for y'all up in Erie about the role of your diocese and bishop in the creation of your model.
Well, so I guess the bishop and or the cathedral dean, I am the cathedral dean. So let's bring it on.
You're in.
Yeah, it was great. Loved it, every second of it. I love drawing diagrams of staff. I actually do. I'm not joking. So anyway, but no, so we sort of came up with it, and this diocese has had a culture of the bishop permitting a large amount of experimentation in the best of possible ways. I benefited from that when I worked in more rural congregations and what we were doing there, and then here. And so, frankly, given that experimentation was sort of a value, I guess, of this diocese, it made sense to just sort of be thinking this way. We've been, our bishop sort of had a sort of like we're all one in the kingdom kind of message for a very long time. And so yeah, one in the kingdom is everybody sort of pulling and working together. And I think, the Diocese of Northwestern Pennsylvania is a small place with a lot of small parishes. And so to the extent that two of the larger parishes choose willingly to come into collaboration for mutual benefit, and because that is a faithfulness to the gospel, right? Like that, I hope sets up a model for other places to consider, which is, I also think, something that is like important, that we not sort of close this down without sort of thinking about like, what's the replicability? I think I just made up that word. What's replicable about these models, right? Like, I mean, the incarnation dictates that you can't take it whole cloth, right? You have to be in your place. That's a primary thing that's just true, and true, sociologically as well as theologically. So, I mean, one of the things that this invites is a sort of thinking about, who could you be in conversation with, and why do we believe the lie of scarcity when actually that there is abundance, because this is what God has equipped us with, right? And like, our diocese supports us. We have grant money from our diocese that has been fabulous every step of the way. And I think we too often fall into these mindsets where we think there isn't enough, or that we need to be self-sufficient, and that is somehow a marker of our success, when in fact, is it? I don't know that it is. And so our mutuality benefits us, and more importantly, in some ways, William Temple said that the church is the only institution that doesn't exist for itself. It exists for people not yet members, and our community benefits. They're not dealing with two entities. We magnify our work with refugees and things. And so if I was going to say what's replicable, it's daring to have these kinds of conversations. It's looking at your context. It's looking at who you could be in conversation with, and not believing the lie that there isn't enough to go around for everybody. So yeah, I just kind of like went on a rant there. But Texas, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think in terms of what's replicable, I just think that these are two similar but different models that just show that it is worthwhile to think bigger than the single parish at one site. And that the beauty of the diocesan model is that we have built-in structures. Like we're not in competition with each other, ideally. The system we're in as Episcopalians is actually kind of, through its governance, imposing collaboration on us. We are intended and meant to partner with other parishes and think about the parish in a sense of our neighborhood rather than a church building. And I think whether or not these particular administrative systems become more common in the Episcopal Church, it is worthwhile to at least call the church in your town and say, how can we do things together? How can, like you said, how can we expand our call to the gospel by knowing one another? And I think that's the core of it all.
Well, this has been a great conversation with y'all. We've benefited a lot from hearing about the Episcopal model up in Erie. So thank y'all.
Likewise, it's been a joy to work with you guys, and we've loved hearing about your model, and just to really appreciate everybody being on with us today.
Yeah, it was great. And, we're always happy to answer other questions offline. Like this is exciting. Innovation in the church, man. It's how we're gonna keep on going. It's faithful.